give a very special word of welcome to everyone at our New King campus. I loved being with you last weekend, how great it was to meet a lot of you that are new with us, and we welcome you this morning if you're new again with us, and to everyone who is at Glenn High School this morning at our Union Cross campus, and everyone at the YMCA in Clemens. Welcome to you guys, and everybody else joining us by video. I'm so happy to be with you this morning. Are you ready for some good news? Yes. You do not have to worry even when you walk through the greatest troubles of your life, because though you and I will face the searing heat of adversity, there is another in the fire. We're in a series we call No Worries. And today we're going to take our deepest dive into the roots and solution, deeper than we've gone thus far, in a story that is marvelous and unveils for us not only the beautiful picture of another in the fire with the saints of God, but unveils for us how the roots of so much worry is found in idolatry. And so we're going to look at a story of Nebuchadnezzar, a fiery furnace, and 3 Hebrew men who have no worries. It is in Daniel chapter 3. If you want to follow along, we'll take up some excerpts of this in Daniel chapter 3. Starting at verse 1, King Nebuchadnezzar, that's the king of Babylon, who had overrun the people of God and exiled them into Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits, its breadth 6 cubits. That's 90 feet high, 9 feet wide. And he set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. And at verse 4, the herald proclaimed aloud, "You're commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon," I had to look that up, it's a triangular string instrument, not just the arch rival of Raven and the comic strip. The trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, you're to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a burning, fiery furnace. I'm going to pick up at verse 12, where we read now about these 3 Hebrew men who refused to do so. There are certain Jews whom you appointed, officials of Nebuchadnezzar are reporting to him, that you've appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Pick up reading at verse 15, and you hear furious Nebuchadnezzar, who says to them, "Now if you're ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, to fall down and worship the image that I've made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning, fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands?" What an ironic statement. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said, "O king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. We really just don't even need to talk about it." And they said, "We don't need to try to defend ourselves. We don't need to try to talk you out of it. We're just not even going to talk about it," is what they said. They're not being rude. They're just being matter of fact, that there was no question about this whatsoever. "If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." Our God can, our God will, but no matter what, we're not going to worship your idol. We will worship the Lord still. And so, in his fury, Nebuchadnezzar, verse 19, ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it usually was heated, And at verse 22, we recognize it backfired on him because the king's order was urgent and the furnace was overheated. The flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And in verse 24, King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, "Did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire?" And they answered and said to the king, "True, O king." And he answered and said, "But I see 4 men unbound, walking in the midst of the fire, and they're not hurt. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods." They emerged from the fire, verse 27, in a lovely line, one of my favorites in all of the scripture. The hair of their heads was not singed, their cloaks were not harmed, and no smell of fire had come upon them. They didn't even smell of smoke. I once preached a sermon on this text entitled, "Smoking or Non-Smoking?" Because when you're in Christ, you are washed so clean, you don't even smell of sin in the nostrils of God. Well, there was a little boy, and he was afraid of going down in the basement in their house. And the mother wanted him to get over it, so one night she said to him, "Johnny, would you go down into the basement, please, and bring the broom up for me?" And Johnny said, "But Mommy, I'm so scared of the basement. Please don't make me go." She said, "Now, Johnny, you need to get over this. There's nothing scary. There's nothing harmful down in the basement. It's just another room in the house." He said, "Please don't make me." And so she said, "Listen, Jesus is with you. Jesus is everywhere. In fact, Jesus is in the basement." So Johnny walked over to the door to the downstairs to the basement and cracked it open. And he cried out, "Jesus, if you're in there, would you bring us up a broom?" Because it's one thing to simply have a cliche and say, "God's with you, so don't be afraid. He's always with you." But it's another thing to sense the presence of God in the midst of your searing adversity. And we come to this story that is, on the one hand, a picture of the fires of life and persecution that can come to the people of God, and the adversities in a general sense that can come to all of us, and how God is with these men in the midst of the fire in such a beautiful way. And that's where we're going with this message, that there's another in the fire. But in order to understand the full meaning of this narrative, you cannot miss it, that it is first all about idols. And how it is that there are these 3 men out of all of the society that refuse to bow down to idols. And interestingly, they're the ones that know the presence of God. They are the ones who seem to have the least fear of all, the ones who are in the greatest physical danger. And so you must start with the beginning of idolatry. And I think you can learn about the birthplace of an idol here. Now, by an idol, we don't just mean physical constructions. I laugh to read about 3 sailors who had a weekend off, and at port, they went and lived in some pretty wild and raucous nights on Friday and Saturday night. And they were feeling so guilty about all their sin that they found a little church to go to in the little town, little port city they were in. And they went to church, and lo and behold, the minister preached on the 10 Commandments, went right through all the 10 Commandments, and the 3 sailors left church. And as they were walking away, they were quiet for quite some time until one of them finally looked at the others and said, "Well, at least we didn't make any graven images this weekend." Well, we tend to think that the idea of idols is something that was relegated to some ancient times or to Eastern religions, Hinduism and Buddhism, that still have physical idols. But idolatry is not really something that is so much about the physical manifestation of the idol as it is a thing that's going on in the heart. In fact, Ezekiel chapter 14, verse 3, the Lord said to him very clearly, "Son of man, these men," speaking of the people who have become idolaters, "have set up idols in their hearts." So clearly the Lord doesn't think of idols only as something that's a physical item, but it's something that can be happening in the heart. And Nebuchadnezzar had set up this huge idol because the idolatry actually began in his own heart. If we had time, we'd go back and read all of Daniel chapter 2, because you really can't understand what's going on in chapter 3 without it. But let me just tell you about chapter 2. What happened was the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, who was arguably the most powerful man in the known world in that day, he had a troubling dream. And so he called all of his wise men, all of his soothsayers, and he said, I need someone to interpret this dream for me. And so they all gathered and they said, oh yes, Your Highness, we'd be glad to interpret the dream. Tell us what the dream is and we'll be happy to interpret it for you. And he said, no, that's not what we're going to do. He said, in order for me to know that you have received the right interpretation of the dream, I want you to tell me what I dreamt and then give me the interpretation. And they said, well, no one but the gods could do this. And he's ready to kill all of his wise men because he exposed them for the phonies that they really were. And they had no real interpretive or prophetic gift. And comes forth Daniel, who is known now as a Hebrew man in Babylon to have been someone who's quite gifted in so many ways and gifted prophetically. And Daniel, in a sense, represents even these pagan soothsayers, and he says, let me appear before the king. And he steps out into this, and he trusts that God's going to give him the interpretation, because if not, Daniel, along with his friends, were going to be killed also, along with all the wise men of Babylon. And he comes to King Nebuchadnezzar, and he says, I can't interpret dreams, but God can. He reveals mysteries. And he says, here's what you dreamt. And God gave it to Joseph, just gave him the whole dream that Pharaoh had been secretly dreaming at night. He said, you saw a statue, and it was of a golden head that then had, and this character in this statue had silver chest and breastplate, and the thigh and the mid-waist was of bronze, and the legs were of iron, and the feet were of clay and iron. And this is what you saw. And he said, and what you saw in your dream was that a stone that was not cut by human hands came and struck the feet of clay and broke the clay feet into pieces, whereupon the iron and the bronze and the silver and the gold all came tumbling down, and like the chaff in the summer wind just blew away like dust. But that rock that had not been hewn by human hands became huge like a mountain and took over the whole world. And it says, this is the interpretation that the Lord gives. You, O King Nebuchadnezzar, and your dynasty are of the golden head. And God has appointed you and allowed you to be in this kingdom of Babylon, and great it is. But there shall be another kingdom, though lesser, will overthrow you. And then following that, there'll be another lesser that will supplant that kingdom. And then there'll be another one, it'll be like iron, it'll be strong, but it eventually will be overthrown by something that looks like it's weak, but it'll be from God. And it will come like a rock, and it will be the kingdom that will never end. And of course, it was a magnificent prophetic image that perfectly described, as scholars look back on it, not on the Babylonian Empire, but the Medo-Persian Empire that is then followed by the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire, and then in the context of the Roman Empire, Jesus, the Son of God, comes, who is the rock, who destroys all other ideologies and false gods, and his kingdom is established, inaugurated on the earth. He said, my kingdom has come, and his kingdom reigns forever and forever. He said, this, O king, is what your dream was all about. Well, at first, Nebuchadnezzar was just absolutely taken by this dream, and he fell down and worshiped God, and he promoted Daniel and put him in great authority. And Daniel said, I have 3 friends. Would you put them in authority? Meshach and Shadrach and Abednego, and they were put in over precincts and governance, and this is the way it all began. But not very long after that, Nebuchadnezzar began to be anxious about all of this. And this is what I want you to see about how an idol is born. Tim Keller said, power is often born of fear, and in turn gives birth to more fear. A lot of people in great leadership roles got there because they were fearful of not having enough power, but then when they did have the power, they lived and feared. The 20th century theologian Reinhold Niebuhr argued that man is insecure, and he seeks to overcome his insecurity by what Niebuhr called a will to power. He pretends that he's not limited. And so what did Nebuchadnezzar do? He built a huge idol. He built this massive golden idol that was 90 feet high and 9 feet wide. It was as if Nebuchadnezzar was saying, if my kingdom is represented by gold, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the image that I dreamt of and I'm going to have it physically made into a huge idol and make it all gold. Scholars think it may have actually been solid gold or at least gold plated, so you can imagine the amount of kingdom resources that went into this idol. You can imagine how huge and daunting this was. And he said, what's going to happen is everybody, as soon as they hear the music and great fanfare, then you have to bow down to the idol and worship the idol. In other words, when he believed Daniel that the kingdom of Babylon had a limited duration in front of it, he became fearful. And instead of coming to the true God and saying, here I come with all of my angst and apprehension, and I trust you no matter what comes, he did what most people do. His idolatrous heart found some way to make him feel as though he were still in control and tried to gain a false sense of security. Wherever our fears are, our idols will likely be. And if you want to understand your idols, therefore, you need to look at what your fears are. Again, Tim Keller, idols give us a sense of being in control, and we can locate them by looking at our nightmares. What do we fear most? What if we lost it would make life not worth living to us? Whatever you say, if blank, then I would really be fulfilled and my life would have meaning. If blank, then I would be secure. Whatever we put into that blank that's not God is idolatrous. And the text, the narrative, is just making fun of the idols. This is what God often does in the scripture. He just, through the prophets, he just mocks the idols because the idol has no life in it. It was made by Nebuchadnezzar, so it can't give him any security. That's what's so ridiculous about idolatry. In fact, just look at this repetition really quickly. Go back through the text and see the repetition. It keeps saying that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Like at verse 2, 3:2, the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Verse 3, the provinces gathered for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Verse 5, all are to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. You just over and over. Verse 7, all the peoples, nations, languages fell down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Verse 12, they do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. And then even Nebuchadnezzar said, is it true at verse 14, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I set up? They said at verse 18, we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. It's just comical over and over like 8 times that you have set up. You have set up. What does it say? It said, you made it, you invented it, you put your resources into it, and you propped it up. Because it's just accentuating, that can't be a God. If there's something that you erected yourself, how could that be a life-giving God? That's the folly of it all. To think that what you make somehow could give you security. And so what he did, in a sense, was in his insecurity, the represented in the golden head of his dream, he just goes further in with more gold. Go in further with the unreliable material that would, in his dream, would one day become like dust. That's the folly of it all. So there's something that we look to for our security, and when we feel insecure and more worried, we just go in further with it. It's like if somebody thinks that money is going to give them a sense of security and they still feel anxious, what do? They just get all the more money that you want to get. That's the way idols work on our lives. Now, idolatry is not really something that replaces God as much as you try to add to God It's why we, even as Christians, we can have idols alongside of our worship of God. You know, it's very interesting. I wish we had time to talk about it, but one of the most powerful and interesting scenes of idolatry happens very early in the life of Israel. In Exodus chapter 32, Moses has gone up to the mountain, and this is where he's going to get the 10 Commandments. But before he even comes down with the 10 Commandments, the people start getting anxious. And in Exodus 32, verse 4, here's what happened. Aaron, Moses' brother, received the gold from the hands of the people and fashioned it with a graving tool and made a golden calf. And he said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt." And Aaron saw this, and he built an altar before it. And Aaron made a proclamation and said, "Tomorrow, look at this. Tomorrow we shall have a feast to the Lord." Isn't that the strangest thing? They just made an idol, and they said, "Tomorrow we're going to have a festival unto the Lord." We're going to do both. That's the way idols work. The idea of anxiety that is demanding a way to be resolved spurs us, if we don't come to the living true God, spurs us towards all manner of other ways to try to quieten the anxiety. It's worth thinking about what the idols have been or are still in your life. You know, one that I think has mainly toppled down in my life years ago, but one that was a strong, I think, idol of my heart for years was the need, the longing for others' approval. Now, idols are not usually bad things. They're usually good things that we try to make ultimate things. So it's not a bad thing to have the favor of people. In fact, we blessed our children every day of their life that they would be blessed to grow in wisdom, stature, and favor with God and with people all the day of their lives. And I think it's a wonderful thing to have favor on your life with people. And so it's something that we should ask of God, and we should bless one another in. The favor amongst people is a good thing. Jesus enjoyed favor amongst people. I think it's a wonderful thing. But if you try to turn that into something that ultimately gives you security, rather than saying it can be a blessing from God when others approve of you and it opens doors for you and it can be a wonderful blessing. Instead, you say, I need to have this or else I don't feel okay about my life. Or to say, if I had everyone's approval, then I would just be fine. And I don't know, perhaps for me, I came from a home where there was brokenness, and maybe it just created a sense of insecurity in the little soul of a fourth grader that just said, I just don't ever want to feel that again. I don't want to feel like that someone has rejected me. And so a lot of my life got shaped by that. And what it was, thankfully, by the grace of God, for me, and this is only the grace of God, it never led me into outright dishonesty or complete manipulation of others, but that was always crouching at the door. But I think what it did for me was it just ruled so much of my thought life. You know, when someone didn't approve, it would just, I would have a brooding sense over that and be wondering, what do I need to gain that person's approval? And that's a very binding thing, isn't it? That's an enslaving of your thought life. I think also I would just tend to have times in which I'd be a little chameleon-like, you know, just adapting my nature a little bit to this person so they would be approving, and this person a little bit different. And sometimes what it meant was I wasn't being as clear and letting my yes be a yes and my no be a no. And sometimes it meant that I had something to say and I wouldn't dare say it. And sometimes it meant that even maybe a creative urge within me that felt too different or something, I might not bring it up. All of these things, what I'm saying, is so binding. Because that's what happens, is that we set up these idols that we think somehow will resolve our security, but instead what it does is it actually adds to our security. Chris Evert, one of the greatest tennis players of all time, had the greatest winning percentage of any female tennis player ever, won so many majors, so many championships. And she wrote of her life, I had no idea who I was or what I could be away from tennis. I was depressed and afraid because so much of my life had been defined by my being a tennis champion. I was completely lost. Winning made me feel like I was somebody. It made me feel pretty. It was like being hooked on a drug. I needed the wins, the applause, in order to have an identity. You see how an idol works? something that you work so hard for. You like serve it, right? Her idea of success, her idea of the applause of people. And you just serve it and you put your resources into it and your energy into it, thinking that it's going to give you life. But instead, what it does is it makes you more anxious. Because the idol itself doesn't have any life to give you. And this is what happened to Nebuchadnezzar. In a furious rage at verse 13, when he saw that Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego would not bow down to his idol, he got in a furious rage. Remember, we've talked about this, that whatever you're angry about, if you look closely enough, there's probably a fear behind it. Nebuchadnezzar had set up an idol to try to deal with his own insecurities, but when 3 men were not scared of Nebuchadnezzar and wouldn't bow down to his idol, it made Nebuchadnezzar fearful that his idol had no real power in the all, and he found himself mocked by the very idol that he'd set up. There's a powerful verse in Jeremiah chapter 10, verse 14. It says, every goldsmith is put to shame by his idols, for his images are false and there's no breath in them. So if you have an idol like mine, if it's an idea of, I've got an idol, I've got to have others' approval or else I can't be okay, then what happens is you set up this idol. It's like something you put on your heart and you put it on the shelf. And I put it up on the shelf, this idea that I need to have other people's approval. But then what happens? As soon as somebody doesn't approve, if somebody rejects me, if somebody doesn't like me, then what happens? Now this idol that I've set up, that I set up, turns to me and says, look at you, you don't have the approval that you so desperately need. You need to try even harder. And it mocks you. There's a powerful commentary on this in Isaiah 46, verse 1. Bel bows down, Nebo stoops, two ancient pagan gods, Bel and Nebo. Their idols are on beasts and livestock. These things you carry are borne as burdens on weary beasts. They stoop, they bow down together. They cannot save the burden, but themselves go into captivity. It is an image of the people of God who are being taken into exile, and their idols have to bow down because they have to tie them and strap them onto the oxen and the cattle who are now going to carry them, or else they're going to have to carry their idols themselves. He's saying, when you have an idol, you have to carry the idol. But he says, listen to me, O house of Jacob, all the remnant of the house of Israel who've been born by me from your birth, carried from the womb, even to your old age. I am he. And to the gray hairs, I will carry you. I have made and I will bear. I will carry and I will save. That's the difference between God and idols. You carry your idols and God carries you. Our idols that we set up to try to deal with our insecurities actually make us more worried and more exhausted. And idolatry sabotages relationship. They place so much of a demand on your attention and your resources and your energy that it makes you lose your awareness of the presence and the love of God. That's what happens with idolatry. It hurts relationship. I have this memory as I think about the fair being in town in Winston, of remembering as a child, I was, I think, in 9th or 10th grade, and Greensboro, and I was going to go to the fair with my best buddy. I'll call him John. And John had his driver's license already, so he was going to pick me up, and we were going to the fair in Greensboro on Friday night. And he didn't show up. And I waited and waited, didn't show up. This was before the day of cell phones. There was no way to call him, no way to know what was going on. And I didn't know what was happening. I just sat at home waiting on him. He never did show up. Finally, I called his house. His mother answered the phone and said, oh, well, it must be some confusion. He went to the fair with so-and-so. And my buddy had this huge longing to be friends with these few guys that were perceived to be the most popular guys in school, and he so wanted to be with them. And what happened was the opportunity came up at the last minute that he could go to the fair with them, and so he just stood me up, and I stayed home. So every time I go to the fair, I just kind of go to the fair like, yeah, I don't care, I'm going to the fair. But what happened in that situation to our relationship and our friendship when I understood that was what was going on? Well, it never was quite the same, was it? Why? Because an alternative allegiance distracts you from an authentic friendship. An authentic friendship with God gets distracted by idols. God doesn't go anywhere. He loves you with his whole heart. God longs for you, loves you. But idols, it's like diverting our attention. You know what the image that came to mind? Would you ever been talking to someone and you're just talking, having a conversation with them, and while you're talking to them, their eyes are looking around the room as if they want to find somebody more interesting than you? Like you're talking to them and they'll look at this way and it's like, and you just realize their attention is elsewhere right now. You can't truly be with someone when you're distracted by an alternative. And so it is that this is a story about three men who were not distracted by the giant idol. They knew God, and they loved God, and they didn't lose their attention of being with God. Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego answered to the king, and they said, "King, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand. But if not, be it known to you, O king, we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you've set up." This is one of the great faith statements in all the Bible. I love this. Our God can, and our God will, but even he doesn't do it the way that I think he's going to do it, I still love him. And I'm going to worship him. My God can and my God will, but no matter what, I'm going to praise him still. That'll carry you through. My God can heal the cancer. My God will heal the cancer. But if it doesn't come in the time or the way that I expect, I'm going to praise him still because he's God. My God can fix this financial situation and he will fix it. And yet, if it doesn't happen the way I envision, I'm going to worship him still. My God can bring home my wayward child. My God will bring home my wayward child. But even if he doesn't, I'm going to praise him still. Because what they were saying is that we're not going to make an idol even out of our vision of the way that God will answer our prayer. We're not going to make an idol out of any of it because our affection and the love of our life is set upon God himself. He is the one who matters to us. And his presence is so dear that they didn't even need to talk about whether they were going to bow down to the idol. And this wonderful little twist in the story that I just love the twist, that it all backfires. I mean, literally backfires, because the king, he says, "I'm so furious." He says, "Turn the fire up." And so they keep turning the fire up and turning the fire up. Make it hotter. And it's almost like a scene of mockery of King Nebuchadnezzar. "How dare them defy my edict? Turn the heat up." "Yes, your royal highness, we'll turn it up." "Are they really still not bowing down? Turn up the furnace." "Yes, your royal loveliness, will turn the fire up." And they just keep saying, "Okay, we'll turn," until it's 7 times. The number 7 in Hebrew means complete. It means as hot as it possibly can get. And he shouldn't have turned it up that hot, because what happened was when he opened up the furnace door, it was so hot that the flames leapt out and killed Nebuchadnezzar's henchmen. It backfired on him. And you just read the Bible over and over. This is what happens. The enemy turns up the heat, and the enemy shouldn't have turned up the heat because it just backfires. I think even of Adam and Eve in the beginning, where the devil just turned up the heat, that serpent who slithered in there and deceived them into sinning. And even then, when they fell into sin, God cursed the serpent and said, "You're going to eat dust." And he said, "But the seed of the woman is going to crush your head." I think of Joseph, who the devil kept turning up the heat. He was thrown into a pit by his brothers. They turned up the heat, put him into slavery, turned up the heat, threw him into jail. But he shouldn't have done it. Because in the end, God used him to save the known world from famine and to save the family of Jacob so that the seed that would one day crush the serpent's head would live on. I think of Moses and how Pharaoh kept turning up the heat and turning up the heat until finally they let Moses go after all those years of bondage and slavery. But then Pharaoh got really mad and turned up the heat. He said, let's send out all of our chariots after him and pin him up against the Red Sea. He shouldn't have done that, should he have? Because God made it backfire as the ocean swallowed up the chariots of Pharaoh. On and on the stories go until finally there comes the Son of Man, the Son of God, Jesus, and he is tempted in the wilderness, and the devil keeps trying to turn up the heat all throughout his life, alluring religious leaders to hate him. And the spirit of religion and the spirit of rebellion conspired to put him on the cross, and they began spitting on him and mocking him, and the devil turned up the heat and turned up the heat, and they scourged him, and they put a crown of thorns on his brow and turned up the heat, and they nailed him to a cross and turned up the heat while the demons persecuted him as he breathed his last, not knowing it was all backfiring on hell, because the very thing that hell thought was a win for them was the greatest loss, because he became our sin, and we who accept Christ are forgiven and set free. We were saved. It backfired on him. There's a whole sermon in that, but let's move on to this. And what happened was that Nebuchadnezzar looks and he sees that there is someone else in the fire, a fourth man, wandering around. And they'd started out bound up, and now they're just cruising around in the fire. You know what's so amazing about this and so true of life? The other man, the fourth man, doesn't appear ahead of time. He appears in the fire. And the Lord doesn't turn down the heat. It's as if he takes the heat for them. And I don't know about you, but I spend so much of my life wishing there just was no fire, and that God would show up before it and just stop the adversity. But as I look back over my life with Christ, I'd say my testimony is more the opposite. It is that there have been fires, but in one way or another, I've found that he's with me in the fire. Who is this? Is it an angel? I think it's a pre-manifestation of Jesus. The same one who had shown up in other odd times, wrestling with Jacob and appearing here and there throughout the Old Covenant. Because Jesus has always existed, and he's always been a deliverer and a Savior. There is another in the fire. The answer to our idolatry is to know that. When our insecurities rise up, idols start creeping around us and saying, how about me? How about me? And Jesus is there. It's not always easy. Next week, a book is going to come out called God's Hostage. It's Andrew Brunson's story. He is a brother of ours in our denomination, a missionary who lives up the street in Black Mountain, and he was imprisoned for 735 days in a Turkish prison and was released October of 2018, and it's his story. And the head of our denomination, Jeff Jeremiah, had a supernatural call that came onto his life, relentlessly calling the church and the world to pray. And eventually, for the first year and a half, there was very little attention given. Eventually, international attention came upon it, and people prayed all over. And Andrew said that in the midst of his incarceration, the conditions were squalid, but what was hardest was the uncertainty of it all. And he said that, honestly, he believed that he was going to just have this easy supernatural joy like Paul had had in prison. He said it didn't come to him that way. He became fearful and anxious. He said at one point he even considered suicide. The uncertainty and heaviness of it all weighed on him so much. And yet, he said that he came to read the writings of a Romanian missionary, a pastor, who was imprisoned and tortured for 14 years, Richard Wurmbrand, under the communist regime. And he read about how Richard Wurmbrand had taken Jesus' words to rejoice and be exceedingly glad in the midst of persecution, and how Wurmbrand began dancing in his prison cell. And so Brunson said, I decided to do the same. I felt no joy, my body was weak, my spirit was sad, but there was something about Wurmbrand's story that captivated me and convicted me as I realized how far I was from Jesus' words. And so he said, each day I would leap around the courtyard. No matter how much I didn't feel like doing it, how hot the sun or how cold the rain, I danced. And he said it began to create a new sense of intimacy and awareness of the presence of God. Asked about his ordeal, the fiery furnace that he faced, a Wall Street Journal article this week said he believes his ordeal was part of God's plan to raise up millions of people around the world who would pray for me. And by praying for me, actually, he was using me as a magnet to draw prayer into Turkey. The regime, Brunson said, has brought Turkey into very difficult times, doing it all in the name of Islam, all this repression, Islam, 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 and that's creating the conditions for many people to turn away from Islam. What then, he says, millions of Turks will become Christians, and I believe so. Whatever you face, I can promise you, your idols offer you nothing but more weariness and more worries. But whatever fire you're in, beloved, take no worry. There's another in the fire, and that's the gospel.